If oxen and horses and lions had hands, and were able to draw with their hands, and create works of art as men do, horses would draw the shapes of gods to look like horses and oxen like oxen, each making their bodies in their own image and likeness. These bold words, thrown out more than 2,500 years ago, belong to an ancient Greek philosopher and poet whose path became the very definition of the eternal search for truth. Xenophanes of Colophon was no dusty bookworm hiding in a study. He was a real wanderer with a lyre in his hands who walked the roads of Hellas for a good 70 years, mocking the gods and the runners and the folly of men. He was that very fellow who took a notion to call a spade and told the whole world that the Greek gods are just a mirror of our own bad ways. If you had met this old man at a feast in southern Italy 500 years BC, you would first have heard his laugh and then his smashing talk against Homer. Xenophanes was the one who spilled the beans about the real nature of the divine, breaking the cozy fairy tale about the thieving gods of Olympus. While those of his time set up statues of Zeus on the altars, he went against the grain and proved that we made up the dwellers of the sky ourselves in our own shape and likeness. We will follow his path from the smoking ruins of Colophon to the shores of Elea and see why his ideas about the oneness of all things made even the loudest talkers fall quiet. His part in history was so great that Aristotle himself, by the old stories, gave a whole book to this vessel of ancient wisdom. Xenophanes is a bridge between the nature study of Anaximenes and the grand logic of the Eleatics. He grew up among the smells of burning Colophon and the Persian onslaught, so in his words there is always a taste of road dust and the salt wind of Sicily. Imagine a man who walks the burning dust of the roads 67 years in a row, leaning on a staff and singing verses that make the hands of the priest shake. Today we will learn what secret he spied in the fossils on the mountaintops, which was 2,000 years ahead of the science of the earth today. What is there in common between a ruined city in Ionia, a champion runner at the games, and the theory that all living things came from mud and water? The answers to these questions lie in the bag of a wandering singer named Xenophanes. Get ready to hear the story of the first fighter against the fake news of old times, who traded a cozy home for the freedom to speak the truth to the faces of kings and athletes. This is a story of how an outcast and a runaway who lost his home in the fire of the Persian invasion managed to push the Olympians off their gold thrones and put in their place a single god who is not like us in body or in thought. Any ancient philosopher frozen for thousands of years in bronze and marble is first of all a living man. And his story begins with the cradle. Little Xenophanes saw the wrong side of the gold stitching even as a child, though his early years in Colophon were more like a long Sunday morning in a garden of paradise. He grew up among the cool marble and the sharp scents of incense that went around his mother, a dazzling beauty wrapped in the soft rustle of the finest silks. It would seem that in such a good life one should only sing praise to the gods of Olympus for their unheard-of bounty. But Xenophanes learned much about this world long before his voice began to change. While the grown folks with serious faces brought gifts to the gold-covered idols, the boy with a kind smile noted that these masters of the sky put him in mind of the guests at his father's feasts, who were just as fussy and greedy for shiny toys. This quiet, sharp sight in the very heart of peace became his first step toward the truth, which turned out to be much more taking than a soft bed and the sweet smoke of his home. We are setting out for the very heart of the 6th century BC. We walk through the gold gates of Colophon where the air is soaked with the scent of precious resins, and in the shade of the porches of philosophy is ripening that is fated to rattle the Olympian pantheon. Today those places are a quiet corner of Turkey in the province of Izmir, not far from the town of Menderes. Sheep graze on the hills, and it's unlikely that any of the locals remember that here once lived people who believed that the gods ought to wear silks as fine as their own. Yet in the year 570 BC, Colophon was living high on the hog. The world around it bubbled like a pot on a fierce fire. In nearby Ephesus, they were only laying the foundation stones for the great temple of Artemis. Athens was just learning to mint its own coins and counted every bronze obol. In Miletus, the old man Anaximander tinkered with his first map of the world. But the Colophonians had no use for maps. They already knew where the choicest slices of the pie lay. To understand how things were arranged there, you need to learn one ancient Greek word, habersign. In plain terms, it means the art of living like royalty, but with such elegance that Zeus himself would envy it. It was not merely a heap of gold under the pillow. It was a whole philosophy of refined luxury. Imagine a gentleman who does not merely put on an expensive cloak, but chooses exactly that shade of purple that perfectly matches the color of the sea at sunset. That is habersign. In those days, it was considered the highest refinement, the stamp of nobility that set a true aristocrat's heart apart from the coarseness of the outside world. Colophon was not just any city. It was a proud member of the Ionian League, the 12 city-states that held the culture and trade of the coast in their hands. But if you think that was a free federation in the spirit of all for one, you do not know the ancient Greeks well. In the year 570 BC, Colophon lived in the shadow of the Lydian kingdom, though it behaved like the richest, most capricious relative in the Ionian family. The Colophonians, being practical people, preferred to pay tribute and trade rather than fight and go to ruin. They were a kind of free vassals. They kept their own laws, their own timocratic government, but they kept one eye on the east, where the Persian lion was already beginning to stretch its limbs. The Lydian king Aleats, father of that Croesus whose name would become a byword for wealth, held the Colophonians as his favorite subjects. They paid him tribute, and he let them fill their purses so tightly that the seams were ready to burst. Where did all that staggering wealth come from? Colophon rested on 3 whales, each one grand in its own way. The first whale was the Golden Cavalry. In those days, owning a war horse was like having a private jet in the garage today. Colophon boasted the finest cavalry in all Hellas. The knightly families, to which Xenophanes' father belonged, were the true elite. They controlled the fertile lands in the valley of the river Castor, and their herds of horses were the envy of every neighbor. When thousands of such horsemen rode out together, the ground shook, and the gleam of their armor could be seen from miles away. The second whale, strange as it may sound, smelled of pine forests and pitch. If you have ever heard the word Colophony, you have stumbled upon a piece of Colophon's legacy. That very name comes straight from the city. Colophonia resina, resin from Colophon. The raw pine sap they shipped out by the shipload would later give its name to Colophony. The stuff violinists use on their bows, electricians rely on for soldering, and chemists still work with today. In ordinary English, it is usually called rosin, but the scientific name preserves the origin, colophony. These people had a near monopoly on the stuff, which was the crude oil of the ancient world. Without it, you could not caulk a proper warship. It would leak and rot, and you could not brew a decent ointment. On the back of that sticky, fragrant export, Colophon piled up enough wealth to look down on the rest of the Greeks with a perfectly justified smirk. And the third whale was transit. Colophon sat squarely on the trade route from Sardis, the Lydian capital, to the coast. They worked as ideal middlemen. They resold Lydian gold, Egyptian ivory, and Phoenician glass. Their exports included resin, fine horses, choice grain, and a wine that, they said, could loosen the tongue of the grimmest Spartan. In return, the city drew in a river of gold dust, purple dye from Phoenicia, slaves from the depths of Anatolia, and those fine fabrics that, no doubt, Xenophanes' mother must have loved so much. All that wealth, gold, resin, commercial profit, The Colophonians did not lock away in chests. They turned it into habersign, the great art of transforming every ordinary day into an impeccable intellectual masterpiece. For young Xenophanes, the city was not merely a collection of buildings. It was a living, breathing space of meaning. This intellectual garden of some 30,000 inhabitants, roughly the size of present-day Helena, the capital of Montana, a city that, like ancient Colophon, takes pride in its rich history and serves as the cultural heart of a vast region where thousands of lives are packed into a few square miles, was itself a vast textbook. As the passions of art and politics run high in Helena today, so in Colophon every alley was a lesson. In the central square, the agora, instead of the grand stone porticos that would later adorn other cities, stood simple wooden stages. There, under the open sky, competing rhapsodes sang, and the boy, sitting on sun-warmed stones, absorbed the rhythms of ancient tales with his whole being. It was a world of living sound, where wisdom was not read but listened to with the heart. Books were rare and costly treasures in those days. Public libraries as we know them did not yet exist. The famous Library of Alexandria was still nearly 200 years away. The agora was the true heart of this world, where thousands of men in heavy, incense-scented cloaks held slow, unhurried conversations about eternal things. In such an environment, even the air felt thick with ideas. The boy grew up in an atmosphere that valued not brute strength, but sharpness of mind and purity of taste. Yet that coin had its other side. Accustomed to the gentle touch of silk and the soft murmur of fountains in the gymnasiums, the city's inhabitants did not notice how their hands had lost the feel of shield straps. They lingered in their beautiful, sun-drenched dream, while time inexorably counted down the last years of their comfortable paradise. Soon enough, world history would knock at their gates with a Persian spear. If Colophon was the heart of Ionia, then the house of Orphemenes, the father of our Xenophanes, was one of those places where that heart beat with a particularly steady and well-fed rhythm. We do not know for certain whether his father was named Orphemenes or Dexius. Ancient historians love to argue about names as hotly as we argue about politics today. But we know for sure that Xenophanes grew up in a house where no one raised their voice unless it was to read Homer aloud. For a little boy, this house was an entire universe. Imagine spacious rooms where the floors of light-colored stone always remained cool, even when the Ionian sun outside was melting the sand along the shore. There was no hurry here. Xenophanes grew up among women whose movements were as smooth as the flow of the Cayster River, and among men who smelled of expensive wine and horse harnesses. His mother, a dazzling beauty, was for him the living image of that very Abersign we spoke of before. He fell asleep to the soft rustle of her finest Lydian garments, and woke to the sound of slaves in the garden beginning to trim the myrtle bushes carefully. The education of a young aristocrat in those years was a serious but pleasant matter. It was not stuffy classrooms with desks. It was long hours on the terrace where a teacher, an old rhapsode with a face as wrinkled as the bark of an olive tree, chanted the Iliad in a melodious voice. Xenophanes learned to pluck the strings of the lyre and to arrange words into hexameters. In that world, people believed that if you could not quote 500 lines of Homer before breakfast, you could hardly call yourself a human being. But it was right here, in this gilded silence, that Xenophanes began to show that very quiet discernment. While other boys imagined themselves as Achilles, Xenophanes, leaning against a warm column, watched the household sacrifices. He saw his honorable father pour expensive wine onto the altar with the most serious expression. He saw the slaves drag the finest bull to appease the gods. The child noted with a gentle smile a strange thing. The gods praised by his teacher demanded exactly the same things that the guests at his father's feasts loved: more meat, more flattery, and more shiny trinkets. It seemed amusing to him that the mighty Zeus, according to Homer, could take offense over a trifle, just like an uncle who was a merchant and had been served wine not diluted enough. These first lessons of doubt were as quiet as the rustle of papyrus, but they were preparing him for the day when he would trade this soft bed for the harsh dust of the roads. This was a time of absolute safety. The 570s BC felt like an endless afternoon. The boy looked at the sea, blue and deep, and did not yet know that in 10 or 15 years that same sea would become his only home. But for now, he simply learned to listen to the silence of the house of Orphemenes, not suspecting that beyond the horizon, in the Persian steppes, men were already saddling their horses, men who would forever close the doors of this paradise. The world that seemed to Xenophanes eternal and unshakable began to crack in the 545th year before Christ. Until that moment, news from the great world reached Colophon like a lazy echo. Someone somewhere was fighting. Some kings replaced other kings. But here, among the vineyards and cool porticos, it seemed no more important than the buzzing of a fly on a hot afternoon. Yet the shadow beyond the eastern mountains was growing, and its name was Cyrus the Great. The first alarming sign was the fall of Sardis, the capital of mighty Lydia. That fabulously wealthy king Croesus, who was for the people of Colophon both a patron and the very model of success, suddenly lay defeated. Legends say he took the oracle's prediction too literally. The oracle said he would destroy a great kingdom, but he did not guess that the kingdom would be his own. For Xenophanes, who by that time had reached about 25 years of age, this became the first serious lesson. Gold, even if you have mountains of it, cannot buy you back from fate when the Persian infantry arrives at your gates. The Persians were people of a completely different stamp. While the people of Colophon spent hours arranging their perfumed curls, the warriors of Cyrus learned 3 things: to ride a horse, to shoot a bow, and to tell the truth. They had none of the soft Lydian luxury, but they had iron discipline and a commander named Harpagus, who swept through Ionia like a wildfire. Colophon, with its famous cavalry and 1,000 men in purple robes, turned out to be completely unprepared for such a visit. It became clear that refined manners and the ability to quote Homer were fine qualities for a feast, but they were utterly useless when facing men who were used to sleeping on the bare ground and eating road dust for breakfast. Our Xenophanes watched as the city filled with a frantic bustle that had no dignity left in it. The proud men of yesterday, who had been arguing about the quality of frankincense just that morning, now huddled on the agora whispering in fear, clutching their little jewelry boxes against their chests. It was in those days that the young philosopher understood a second bitter truth. He looked at the temples of the gods, to whom his fellow citizens offered rich sacrifices, and he saw that the gods were silent. Zeus did not hurl lightning bolts at the Persian supply trains. Apollo did not hurry to string his silver bow to defend those who sang his hymns so beautifully. The shadows from the east proved stronger than the myths of Olympus. When the Persian army approached the city walls, Xenophanes faced a choice that split his life into a before and an after. He could stay and become a subject of the great king, bowing his head and keeping part of his wealth at the price of his freedom. Or he could walk away into nowhere, keeping only his thoughts and his lyre. The 545th year became for him a time of great farewell. Looking back at the familiar porticos and his father's house, he understood that the Garden of Paradise where he had grown up would never be the same again. A black sun of Median rule had risen over Colophon, and Xenophanes chose the path of the exile. He preferred the salt water of the sea and the hard dust of foreign roads to the golden chains of his native home. In the 545th year BC, Xenophanes stood on the shore of the Aegean Sea and watched thick smoke rising over Colophon. This was not the smoke of festive sacrifices. the kind he had known since childhood. This was the heavy soot of burning ruins. The Persian commander Harpagus had not come merely for tribute. He had come for the very soul of Ionia, for the 25-year-old aristocrat, whose hands still remembered the cool touch of his father's marble. This moment became a point of no return. Leaving paradise is always hard, especially when that paradise is your own home. Xenophanes watched his neighbors, those same 1,000 men in purple cloaks, frantically loading golden cups and Lydian fabrics onto ships, trying to save the fragments of their former luxury. But our hero, it seems, already understood one simple thing. You cannot carry away with you a life that has already ended. He took only his lyre, and that store of thoughts which weighs nothing at all, yet is worth more than all the treasures of King Croesus. If you had stood beside him on the deck of that departing ship, you would have felt how the world changes in a tactile way. Instead of the fragrance of myrrh and rose oil, there was the sharp, piercing smell of iodine and rotting seaweed. Instead of a soft bed, there were hard planks reeking of salt. This was a physical farewell to Abrasine, to that very delicate luxury that had lulled Colophon to sleep for so long. Xenophanes left not as a conqueror, but as a refugee, one of thousands of Ionians who abandoned everything for the sake of a ghostly freedom in the West. The ships set a course for Sicily and southern Italy. They say that when the coast of Colophon finally disappeared below the horizon, Xenophanes did not turn around. He was one of those people who burned their bridges not for the sake of a dramatic gesture, but because ahead of him waited a truth that cannot be found while sitting in the shade of his father's garden. From that moment, his home became all of Hellas, and his family became those who were ready to listen to his bold verses. The farewell to the Ionian shore was for him not merely an emigration. It was the birth of the wandering sage. He left behind gold, titles, and the predictable future of a wealthy horseman. Ahead lay 67 years of wandering, strangers' feasts, and dusty roads. But it was there, in exile, that he found what no golden Colophon could ever have given him: the right to speak the truth to gods and men directly to their faces. Today, looking at the quiet Turkish hills where his city once stood, it is hard to imagine the storm of feelings that raged in the young poet's heart. But it was that salty wind of the year 545 that fanned the flame of his philosophy, a flame that has not gone out for 2,500 years. And here, in our story, appear the characters without whom the name of Xenophanes might not have been preserved for posterity. Their names were Parmeniscus and Aristotus. These gentlemen were not simply connoisseurs of wisdom. They belonged to the school of the Pythagoreans, an influential religious and philosophical brotherhood founded by the great Pythagoras. By that time, the founder of the school himself had most likely already passed away, but his followers, such as Parmeniscus and Aristotus, continued his work. Diogenes Laertius, that old gossip whom you cannot trust on his word, but who is devilishly interesting to listen to, tells us in his work Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers a most curious thing. Relying on the earlier author Favorinus, he reports that it was Parmeniscus and Aristotus who bought Xenophanes out of slavery. But do not rush to shed tears of tenderness and offer prayers for their kindness. In the ancient world, being bought out of slavery was a delicate matter. More often than not, it was about debt bondage. A man who found himself in trouble borrowed money and, being unable to pay, became a living pledge. And then people with money would appear and buy out such a debtor. But this was not charity. As a rule, the man who was bought out found himself in a new dependence, no less harsh. The Pythagoreans were famous not only for mathematics and mysticism, but also for their skill at getting talented people into their hands. Xenophanes by that time was not yet a famous philosopher whose name thundered across all Hellas. But he was a man of rare education, brilliant mind, and sharp tongue. In those days, a literate Greek who could compose poetry and conduct debates was worth his weight in gold. For the Pythagoreans, those calculating managers of philosophy, Xenophanes was an ideal acquisition. A teacher, a lecturer, an intellectual star who could attract new followers and students to their school. They did not buy just a slave. They invested in intellectual capital. There is even a version that these pious saviors might have been involved in the very situation that landed Xenophanes in the debt pit, only to rescue him afterwards and bind him to themselves forever. However, there are no precise historical witnesses to this. It is more likely that they simply took advantage of the circumstances to acquire a valuable asset for their ranks. One way or another, the shadow of slavery passed across his biography like a diagonal scar. He learned in his own skin what it meant to stand on the stones of the slave market under the evaluating gazes of buyers. But it was this very experience that burned out of him the last remnants of Colophonian arrogance. He understood that freedom is not when you own slaves, but when you yourself are not a slave to other people's ideas and other people's purses. Having escaped from the grasping hands of Parmeniscus and his company, Xenophanes finally decided that it was better to be a wandering poet with an empty stomach than a well-fed ideologue in someone else's order. He adjusted his lyre, turned his back decisively on his saviors, and set off walking along the roads of Hellas, having decided that from now on his only master would be his own mind. After Xenophanes left behind the hospitable embraces of the Pythagoreans, a question stood before him in full height, the very question that torments every immigrant. With what, exactly, should one buy bread and wine if your hands are not used to the plow, and your war horse has long since fallen to some Persian sergeant? The answer found itself. In those days in Hellas, there existed a rather honorable, though slightly wandering, profession, the rhapsode. If you think that a rhapsode is merely a street singer with sad eyes, then you are greatly mistaken. In the 6th century before Christ, he was a living television, a radio station, and a Wikipedia all in one bottle. Rhapsodes stitched songs together. The very word literally means a stitcher of songs. They wandered from city to city, reciting Homer in such a way that the audience would hold their breath. Xenophanes, with his aristocratic education and a voice trained by the best teachers of Colophon, fit perfectly into this market. But our hero would not have been Xenophanes if he had simply droned on drearily about the wrath of Achilles. He quickly figured out that the public could be captivated not only by classics, but also by original content. He began to insert his own elegies and satires into his performances. Imagine this picture. A crowd gathers in the city agora. People expect the familiar stories about the Olympian gods. And then this bold Ionian steps into the center of the circle and begins to mock those very myths by which these people had lived for centuries. This was a risky business. Performing before a crowd is not like philosophizing in the shade of porticos. Here, you needed the hide of a hippopotamus and a tongue like a razor. Xenophanes turned his performances into an intellectual show. He combined the charisma of a rock star with the sharpness of a modern stand-up comedian. He sang that gods do not steal and do not commit adultery, and that if bulls had hands, they would draw their gods in the form of bulls. Did he make millions from this? Hardly, but there was enough for a decent cloak and a bowl of good wine. His office was the feasts of rich Greeks in Sicily and southern Italy, where for a good song they might shower him with gold or leave him for the night. It was during this period that he finally honed his style. Light, ironic, hitting the mark precisely. He became the first freelance philosopher in history, proving that a thought is a commodity that is always in demand if you know how to present it properly. Xenophanes no longer belonged to Colophon. He belonged to all Hellas, and his lyre became his only but most reliable pass to eternity. If you think that the modern midlife crisis is when a man buys a sports car and leaves for a 2-week vacation, then you simply have not met Xenophanes. This honorable gentleman turned his exile into such a long tour that modern rock stars with their world tours look like homebodies next to him. Xenophanes himself admitted in his verses, "For 67 years I have been carrying my thoughts around the Greek land." Imagine this scale. 67 years is an entire lifetime by the standards of that era. When he left Colophon, he was a young man with a burning gaze. When he ended his journey, he was a deep old man whose forehead was cut with wrinkles like a map of those very roads along which he had walked thousands of miles. His office was the dusty tracts of Sicily, southern Italy, Malta, and mainland Greece. He was a kind of wandering knight of thought, who had a lyre instead of a sword and impenetrable irony instead of a shield. The life of a freelance rhapsode in such a regime was not only applause at feasts. It was hundreds of nights spent under the open sky. It was meager food from a traveling bag and the eternal changing of faces before his eyes. Xenophanes understood that truth does not sit in one place. It reveals itself to the one who is ready to wear out more than one pair of sandals in search of answers. He saw how cities were born and died, how rulers changed, and how some superstitions gave way to others, more refined but no less foolish. His path ran through Messina, Catana, and Syracuse. In each new city, he stepped into the square and began his stand-up. He was a living link between the great culture of lost Ionia and the new seething life of Magna Graecia. 67 years on the road made his vision incredibly sharp. He learned to see the essence of things through any purple robe and any golden ornament. For Xenophanes, the road became the only form of freedom. He belonged to no single polis. He obeyed no tyrant. He was not dependent on the whims of local gods. His home was the entire Greek Mediterranean. This grand journey transformed the soft aristocrat into a steel-wise man who, by the age of 92, had preserved the clarity of his mind and a sharpness of tongue that the best satirists of all time would envy. He walked forward without looking back, and with each step his thoughts became purer, shedding unnecessary chaff, until they turned into that very pure mind about which he would later tell the whole world. Imagine an old man sitting on a sun-warmed stone slab in the middle of a noisy square. Around him are merchants, fishermen, thieves, priests, children, dogs. An ordinary day in a Greek city. But the old man suddenly begins to speak, not loudly, with a smirk, and within a minute, the square falls silent, because he is laughing at something that no one here has ever laughed at before. He is laughing at Homer. In those days, Homer was not merely a poet. Homer was the Bible, the school, and the encyclopedia all in one bottle. If you are Greek, you know Homer by heart. If you are Greek, you believe that the gods of Olympus are exactly like that. Wrathful, jealous, fond of stealing another man's wife or punishing an entire city for an incautious glance. Hesiod added to this picture his works and days and his theogony, the genealogy of the gods, in which Zeus overthrows his father and that father overthrows his own. Quite a family. And then Xenophanes, this eternal wanderer with a lyre in a worn-out case, tells people to their faces, "You read about the gods, and you do not see that they are yourselves." Only worse. He does not write thick books. He writes short, angry, funny poems. He calls them psiloi, to translate very roughly, mockeries. But these are not mere mockeries. They are little bombs wrapped in the beautiful paper of the hexameter. The hexameter is the very meter of Homer himself, the same rhythm under which the Greeks for centuries listened to the wrath of Achilles and the cunning of Odysseus. And Xenophanes takes this meter and pours his own words into it. It is as if someone today took the melody of the national anthem and sang verses about the king being naked under it. This is no longer just campfire songs. This is a true intellectual duel. The weapon is not a sword but a sharp word, and Xenophanes strikes straight at the jaw. He says, Everything that people consider shameful, theft, deceit, adultery, Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods. Just think about it. The gods to whom people pray, whom they thank for the harvest, from whom they ask for protection at sea, these gods behave worse than drunken sailors in a port. And no one is outraged. No one says, "Hey, something is not right here." Xenophanes speaks. He asks, if the gods are born, then there was a time when they did not exist. And if they did not exist, then they are mortal. An immortal god is like an honest seller of used chariots. It happens, but very rarely and not for long. Not much from this old man has come down to us. About 45 fragments. Sometimes they say 34. That is only 121 lines. One little papyrus boat in the middle of an ocean of lost books. And yet there were 5 whole books of the Siloi. 5. Imagine 5 tight scrolls, covered in the small, nervous handwriting of a man who walked the roads for 67 years and wrote down his mockeries wherever he could, in port taverns, on stones, on the backs of other people's letters. He used the same meter as his enemies. He put on their armor to strike them with their own weapons. The hexameter is not merely a verse. It is the breath of Homer, and Xenophanes learned to breathe the same air and exhale into it poisonous, cheerful truths. His Siloi flew across Hellas faster than news of a shipwreck or word that oil had become cheaper in a neighboring town, because laughing at the pompous is always terribly entertaining. But Xenophanes did not merely laugh. He taught people one very important thing. He taught them to doubt. He showed them, look, this beautiful wrapping is only a wrapping. Inside there is emptiness, or what you yourselves have put there. Homer sang about the gods. Xenophanes sang that the gods were invented by people, and his song turned out to be long-lived. We remember it still, because doubting authority is perhaps the only tradition that never dies. Imagine an old philosopher sitting on the edge of a market square, not on a tribune, not on a platform, simply on a stone warmed by the sun. Beside him is a basket of dried figs and a jug of water. On his knees is a worn-out case with a lyre inside, and in his eyes is that cunning little spark that appears in a man when he has thought of something truly funny. And then he begins to speak, not loudly, almost in a whisper, but in such a way that within a minute a crowd gathers around him, because the old man is telling a story about oxen and about lions. Imagine, he says, that oxen had hands, and that they knew how to draw. Like humans. What would they draw? The crowd is silent. Someone smiles. They would draw gods, continues Xenophanes, who look like oxen, with horns, with hooves, with big moist eyes, and they would worship them at their oxen altars. And the lions? Lions would draw lion-shaped gods, with manes, with claws, with a regal bearing, and each would swear that this is exactly what a true master of the universe must look like. The square freezes, and then someone begins to laugh, first softly, then louder, because the old man has spoken the truth, that very truth which everyone had always known but no one had dared to say out loud. Here it is, the brilliant move of Xenophanes. He does not argue. He does not prove. He does not bring 100 arguments. He simply paints a picture. Oxen praying to ox-shaped gods. Lions praying to lion-shaped gods. And this picture is impossible to forget. He caught humanity by the hand, right at the scene of the crime. We always thought that the gods looked like us because we looked in the mirror and said, yes, that is him. That is Zeus. The same beard, the same anger, the same love of roasted meat and beautiful women. And Xenophanes quietly removes the mirror and says, look up. That is not your reflection up there. That is something else, something much greater. This was not a boring lecture on theology. It was a story, a parable, a joke that turned out to be deeper than any philosophical argument. Xenophanes did not destroy the old gods. He simply showed that they are like shadows on the wall of a cave, beautiful but not real. and that the true God cannot look like an ox or a lion, or even like the most beautiful man in the most expensive tunic. He did not shout, "There is no God." He said something else. God exists, but he is not what you think. He is not born, does not die, does not envy, does not fight. He is one. He is everything, and he cannot be drawn. He can only be felt. And the strange thing was this. The priests did not become angry. They simply became confused, because the old man did not blaspheme. He laughed, and it is hard to argue against laughter, especially when the laughter is so kind and so truthful. Xenophanes removed the bearded men with lightning bolts from the sky and placed there something terrifyingly beautiful, incomprehensible. 1. He did not build a temple to his idea. He simply drew oxen and lions. And that turned out to be enough to turn the world upside down. Quietly, without thunder, to the laughter of an old wanderer. Imagine an old man with a lyre on a dusty road. He is in no hurry. Ahead of him lie many more years, and behind him lie even more. He walks from city to city, from port to port, and everywhere he stops, squats down, and looks, not like a scholar, like an artist, like one who draws not with a brush, but with his eyes. One day he arrives at a noisy bazaar in some trading town. To his right are tall, dark-skinned people who have sailed from the south. They laugh, they haggle, they hold in their hands little wooden gods with flat noses. To his left are northern warriors with fiery red hair, and their amulets show blue-eyed bearded men with stern faces. Xenophanes stands aside for a long time, leaning on his staff. And then quietly, almost in a whisper, he says to himself, "Look at that. The Southerners have made their gods look like Southerners, and the Northerners have made theirs look like Northerners." He does not laugh. He simply notices. As a child notices that the morning dew on the leaves smells different from the rain on a hot roof. If the gods lived in the mountains of Thrace, he thinks, they would have red beards and a habit of shouting loudly into the wind. And if they were born in the lands of the distant south, their skin would be dark like the bark of an old oak, and they would dance to the rhythms of drums. And each would believe that this is exactly what a true master of the universe must look like. And here is where the magic happens. Xenophanes does not argue. He does not prove. He simply shows people a little picture. Two gods drawn by different hands. And this picture softly, without the clang of swords, destroys the wall that people have been building for centuries. "Do you really think," he says, "that the one who created the sky and the sea cares about the color of your hair, about the shape of your nose, about how you braid your beard?" He looks at them with a kind smirk, like a grandfather explaining to his grandson that the stars do not fall to the earth because they are glued to the heavenly dome. Only here it is the opposite. He says that the stars are not glued, and the gods are not like us, and that our reflection in the water is not a portrait of the universe. He is listened to by merchants and fishermen, old women with baskets and boys with clay whistles. And someone suddenly understands. It is true. We simply draw ourselves, and we pray to ourselves. And up there, perhaps, there is someone completely different. Someone who looks like neither a Thracian, nor a Greek, nor a Southerner. Someone who simply is. Xenophanes does not build temples and does not write thick books. He simply wanders the roads and tells stories. Stories about lions and oxen, about black and red-haired gods. And these stories, like dandelion seeds, scatter all over the world. And somewhere far away, hundreds of years later, something big and bright will grow from them. Something that will be called science, or philosophy, or simply the ability to look at the world through someone else's eyes. Imagine an old room. Not the kind where people live, but the kind they carry inside themselves. The head. For years, junk has been piling up in it. Fears, fairy tales, promises of priests, pretty pictures of gods with golden halos, angry looks from under stone brows. And then one day an old man with a lyre enters this room. He does not break down the door. He simply opens the window. A fresh wind rushes inside. Dust rises in a column, and a great cleaning begins. Xenophanes was not a vandal. He did not smash statues with a hammer and did not set fire to temples. He did something far more terrifying to the priests. He asked questions, in a quiet, calm voice. And he smiled. "Look," he said, pointing to a majestic temple with columns, to a priest in white robes, to the smoke of sacrifices rising into the sky. "Look carefully. Do you see a god? Or do you see your own fears dressed up in purple and gold?" People stopped. They listened, because he was not shouting. He spoke like a grandfather sitting on a porch and mending an old fishing net. "You know," he would add, "if your ship sank, it was not Zeus who got angry. It was you who caulked the planks badly. And if you lost a battle, it was not Athena who turned away. The enemy was simply stronger and smarter." And in this simplicity there was enormous power. Xenophanes removed the angry, bearded men with lightning bolts from the sky and placed there an emptiness. No, not an emptiness. He placed there order, law, a rhythm that can be understood, studied, measured. He said, "Stop looking for guilty parties among the clouds. Look at the stars. Count them. Understand how they move. And then, perhaps, you will see something real. Not a picture drawn by some poet 300 years ago, but what truly exists." This was destruction. Yes, but not evil destruction. It was cleaning, like when you finally decide to throw out the old junk from the attic. At first it is frightening, but then it becomes light, and the air becomes different. Xenophanes did not leave people with their old cozy gods, with whom they could talk, whom they could bribe with a cake or wine. He left them with the universe, huge, cold, beautiful, incomprehensible. And he said, "Here, look, and do not be afraid." He did not promise that the truth would be easy. He promised that it would be real. And that was far more frightening than the anger of Zeus. But also far more important. In his smashing of idols, there was not a drop of bitterness, only hope. Hope that people would finally stop looking down at their feet and raise their heads to the sky, not to ask for things, but to understand. And in this quiet, calm revolution, there was more true piety than in all the golden offerings that had ever lain on the altars of Colophon. Imagine that you have spent a whole day drawing a portrait of your grandfather. He has a gray beard, a kind smile, and warm hands. And then you put down your brushes, step back, and suddenly think, what if the one who created these mountains, these clouds, and these distant stars does not look like a grandfather at all? What if he has no beard, no hands, not even a face? This is exactly the feeling that Xenophanes' listeners experienced when the old wanderer stopped laughing at the thieving gods and suddenly spoke words that made the whole square fall silent. "One God," he said quietly, but so that even those on the farthest benches could hear him. "The greatest among gods and men, not like mortals either in body or in mind." Around him stood temples where people prayed to Zeus with his bushy beard, to Athena in her shining helmet, to Apollo with his golden curls. People were used to the idea that a god is like a human being, only stronger, more beautiful, more immortal. He can get angry, fall in love, steal another man's wife, throw a lightning bolt at an offender. He has a face. He has a body. He has a character. And Xenophanes took all of this away, with one movement of his hand. And in the place of old good Zeus with his anger and passions appeared something terrifyingly empty, and terrifyingly full at the same time. "He has no hands," said Xenophanes. "Because why would the one who rules the entire universe reach out for a cup of wine? He has no feet, because he does not need to go anywhere. He is already everywhere. He has no face, because he cannot be depicted. He can only be felt, like the wind, like warmth, like a thought that is born in silence." Imagine the amazement in the market square. People stopped chewing. Merchants forgot their prices. Children froze with clay whistles in their hands. Because the old man was speaking of a God who demands no sacrifices, accepts no flattery, does not punish and does not reward. He simply exists, and all that he does is think, with one whole, infinite, non-human thinking. If we think in parts, explains Xenophanes, first one thing, then another, then a third, he thinks everything at once. All the stars, all the winds, all the fates, with a single movement. And in this there was a strange, unfamiliar beauty. No one had taught them of such a God. Not Homer, not Hesiod, not the priests in the temples. But when Xenophanes spoke, there was something in his voice that made people want to fall silent and look at the sky, not to ask for rain or good fortune, but simply, with quiet respect. Xenophanes did not build temples. He did not call for prayers. He simply invited people to imagine a greatness that needs no mirror, a greatness that does not look down at us from on high and does not wait for bows. It simply turns the stars, breathes the winds, and waits for us to lift our heads on our own. For the first time in many centuries, people heard, "Your God is not like you." And this is wonderful. This means that he is truly great. If the Olympian gods of Homer resembled fussy middle managers, forever rushing somewhere, arguing with someone, and trying to be in 10 places at once, then the god of Xenophanes is the embodiment of absolute calm. Our philosopher introduced a concept that would make any athlete blush with shame. The divine being does not need to swing a sword or hurl lightning bolts to bring order to the universe. He governs all things without effort, by the power of his mind alone. This is that very pure mind which stands behind the scenes of the visible world. Imagine an invisible gravity of intellect that pierces every atom, every star, and every drop of water in the Aegean Sea. Xenophanes insists that it is not fitting for God to wander here and there. For him, the very thought that the highest being must move through space sounds like a ridiculous joke. If a god goes somewhere, then he was not there before. And if he was not somewhere, then what kind of god is he? In Xenophanes' system, the divine principle always abides in the same place, in a state of eternal and unmoving rest. But do not confuse this rest with idleness. This is not the silence that reigns in an abandoned house. This is the super powerful concentration that one can feel at the center of a working whirlwind. The god of Xenophanes is not a personality with whom you can sit over a cup of wine. He is the logos itself, pure intellect, which penetrates all things. He does not issue orders with a thunderous voice. He simply thinks the world, and the world obediently arranges itself according to this great thought. This is a kind of remote control of the universe, where the signal is truth itself. For the young Xenophanes, who grew up in the luxury of Colophon where every desire was fulfilled at the snap of a slave's fingers, such a model of governing the world was perfectly understandable, but raised to an absolute. He stripped God of a body, stripped him of muscles and sinews, leaving only a dazzling, pure function of knowing and willing. This was a god architect, a god mathematician, who holds the dome of the sky not on his shoulders, but on the tip of his logical deduction. Having destroyed the familiar altars, Xenophanes erected a new one, invisible but unshakable, where the only sacrifice worthy of acceptance was the clarity of the human mind, capable at least for a moment of touching this great stillness. If you have ever tried to catch a soap bubble in midair, then you have some idea of the confusion the Greeks felt when Xenophanes presented his new idea. Our old man, who in 67 years of wandering had seen more commotion than all the Olympian gods combined could ever dream of, suddenly declared, "Enough running around." The main idea of Xenophanes was as simple and solid as a rock in the Aegean Sea. Being is unmoving. Listen to this. This is not a story told in children's nurseries to lull infants to sleep. This is a true philosophy of stillness. Xenophanes looked at a world where everything is always rushing somewhere. being born, dying, and bustling about, and he understood that all of this is merely a ripple on the surface of a deep well. In his view, true being cannot run errands like a messenger boy. If a god or the universe began to move from point A to point B, then at point B they were not there before, and that already smells of some cheap counterfeit, not divine greatness. Xenophanes insisted that what exists always remains in the same state. It does not need to bustle about to govern the world. This idea of unmoving and monolithic being was so powerful that later Parmenides grabbed hold of it with a death grip. We have already told the story in detail of how this young man turned his teacher's guesses into a true logical fortress in our video about Parmenides on our channel. If you want to understand how all of European thought grew out of this stillness, you should watch it. For Xenophanes himself, this was the highest form of intellectual honesty. He seemed to be saying to his listeners, look at the stars. They do not race each other. They simply shine. True power needs no gesticulation and no running about. The philosophy of stillness became his answer to the chaos of exile. Let the Persians capture cities. Let the markets roar and ships sink. True being stands unmoving, not stirring and not changing. If you still seriously believe that a god absolutely needs glass pupils to spy on mortals or eardrums to eavesdrop on their kitchen gossip, then you are simply stuck together with the ancient Greeks in the children's sandbox of anthropomorphism. Xenophanes, who during his years of wandering had looked his fill at thousands of marble idols with empty eye sockets, decided to present this heavenly bureaucracy with a final bill. His idea was simple and merciless to any imagination. The divine being has no separate spare parts or sense organs, because it is itself one solid, concentrated, and all-encompassing sense. Listen to how this old man hammers his words into eternity. With his whole being he sees, with his whole being he thinks, and with his whole being he hears. In this picture of the world, there is no room for anatomical atlases, visits to the eye doctor, or cleaning of ear canals. Xenophanes found it terribly funny to imagine the highest principle fussily turning its head to spot a troublemaker on some dusty edge of the oikoumene. In his coordinate system, God is a total and instantaneous intellect, free of physical limitations. If a certain power is present everywhere and at all times simultaneously, then it does not need to direct its gaze anywhere, because absolutely everything that exists is already inside its infinite perception. This is not a philosophy to be dully chewed under a monotonous drone in dusty lecture halls. This is pure and cold contemplation for those who are ready for a truly deep dive. Imagine an ocean that feels the movement of every microscopic grain of sand on its floor, not because it has a million eyes on stalks, but because it is that colossal volume of water. The god of Xenophanes is not another capricious character in a tunic with whom one can bargain for the forgiveness of sins in exchange for a couple of roasted beef thighs. This is a pure function of awareness, completely freed from human fuss, nerve endings, sweaty palms, and foolish emotions. At the very time when Xenophanes was trampling the roads of Italy and Sicily with his sandals, the whole world seemed to have broken free from its chain in an attempt to think of something like this. It was an amazing 6th century before Christ, when humanity suddenly decided to grow up in all corners of the planet at once. While our refugee from Colophon was smashing the Olympian idols at the other end of the earth, in the dry valleys of India, Prince Siddhartha Gautama had already set aside his crown and come to the conclusion that the world is not an arena for the games of gods, but an infinite stream of causes and effects. In China, the wise Lao Tzu at the same time was writing down his paradoxical thoughts about the Tao, an invisible and unmoving way that governs everything without having either hands or a voice. The world was literally boiling with ideas about the one, and Xenophanes was by no means a random voice in this global chorus. One cannot pass by the most obvious parallel, which practically jumps into the eyes of anyone who has ever opened an old scroll. While the Greeks were only just beginning to suspect that their gods looked suspiciously like themselves, among the ancient Jews the idea of a single god was already carved in stone and written into the law. But look at the subtle difference here. The God of the Israelites, for all his fearsomeness and uniqueness, still remained a jealous, angry, and at times very partial judge of his people. Xenophanes went even further in his coldness. His God is not a national leader and not a father-mentor. It is a cosmic mind, to which sacrificial smoke and hymns of praise are equally indifferent. In Persia, in those same years, Zarathustra taught about the great battle of light and darkness, subordinating everything to the will of a single Ahura Mazda. But Xenophanes seems to be the only one among them all who dared to completely deprive the divine being of even a hint of a human character. He turned God into a flawless thinking sphere that holds the dome of the sky not with muscles, but with the flawless logic of its own existence. He was the first in Hellas to explain that true greatness needs no tools. It needs no pupils to catch photons of light, no eardrums to vibrate from sound waves. It simply is. Eternal, unchanging, and absolutely attentive cosmos. In this universe, there are no more dark corners where one can hide from this total presence, because the very space in which you breathe is its sight, its hearing, and its only thought. On the tops of hills where even the fiercest storm cannot send salt spray. And he draws a conclusion that sounds simple to us today, but sounded like madness to his contemporaries. Land and sea are forever exchanging places. Where goats graze today, fish once swam. And where waves crash now, perhaps in thousands of years olive groves will grow. This is not a punishment from the gods, not the anger of Poseidon, not a curse for sins. It is simply a natural, slow, endless process. A cycle, the breathing of the earth. Xenophanes did not know how long these cycles lasted. He had no instruments and no numbers. But he felt that it was very long, much longer than people remember, much longer than is written in the songs of Homer. He looked into the depth of time and was not afraid, because he understood that the world does not stand still. It breathes. It changes. And in this change there is nothing personal. It is simply a law. Stones do not lie, unlike poets. If you want to know the truth about the history of the earth, you do not have to look to the sky. It is enough to bend down and pick up a cobblestone. And in this simple truth, there was something amazingly calming. Xenophanes did not promise people salvation. He did not offer rewards after death. He simply showed them the imprint of a fish on a hilltop and said, "Look, here is the true history. No one invented it, and no one embellished it." His testimony of stones became the first silent witnesses of the past. He did not build theories about the end of the world. He simply understood that the earth remembers everything. And if you learn to read its memory, you can learn more about the world than from many serious books. On the tops of hills where even the fiercest storm cannot send salt spray. And he draws a conclusion that sounds simple to us today, but sounded like madness to his contemporaries. Land and sea are forever exchanging places. Where goats graze today, fish once swam. And where waves crash now, perhaps in thousands of years olive groves will grow. This is not a punishment from the gods, not the anger of Poseidon, not a curse for sins. It is simply a natural, slow, endless process. A cycle, the breathing of the earth. Xenophanes did not know how long these cycles lasted. He had no instruments and no numbers. But he felt that it was very long, much longer than people remember, much longer than is written in the songs of Homer. He looked into the depth of time and was not afraid, because he understood that the world does not stand still. It breathes. It changes. And in this change there is nothing personal. It is simply a law. Stones do not lie, unlike poets. If you want to know the truth about the history of the earth, you do not have to look to the sky. It is enough to bend down and pick up a cobblestone. And in this simple truth, there was something amazingly calming. Xenophanes did not promise people salvation. He did not offer rewards after death. He simply showed them the imprint of a fish on a hilltop and said, "Look, here is the true history. No one invented it, and no one embellished it." His testimony of stones became the first silent witnesses of the past. He did not build theories about the end of the world. He simply understood that the earth remembers everything. And if you learn to read its memory, you can learn more about the world than from many serious books. Those very shells on the mountaintops of Syracuse and the fish imprints in the Sicilian quarries were for Xenophanes not merely souvenirs from the past, but dispatches from the front. He saw in them proof that the sea had once delivered a crushing blow and flooded the land, turning everything into mud. But then the earth struck back, the water retreated, and olive trees grew on the seafloor. This endless cycle, where yesterday's beach becomes a mountain peak and a flourishing city becomes an abyss, led our old man to a bold thought. He understood that the world is not a static stage set, but an eternal clash of elements. To appreciate the scale of this conclusion, one must understand what filled the head of a typical sage of the 6th century before Christ. In those days in Hellas, there was an intellectual sport in fashion, the search for the arche. The word sounds pompous, but its essence is as simple as a brick. The arche is the first principle, that very basic substance from which absolutely everything is made, from your left sandal to the starry sky. The philosophers of Miletus literally competed to see who could find the coolest first brick. Thales, for example, claimed that the arche was water. Everything came from moisture and would return to moisture. Anaximenes disagreed and bet on air, believing that all existing things are simply different degrees of its condensation. And then there was Anaximander, who played his trump card and invented the apeiron, a kind of boundless and indefinite something from which everything hatches. They were all searching for a single magic bullet that would explain the structure of the universe. But Xenophanes, who had walked the roads for 67 years, only chuckled at these attempts to reduce everything to a single variable. He was too pragmatic for such tricks. Instead of inventing abstract apeirons, he took the two most understandable and tangible elements, earth and water, dry and wet. But his genius was not in doubling the bet. He added the energy of struggle to this equation. For Xenophanes, the world is not a peaceful coexistence of earth and water, but their eternal, furious brawl. This was the first concept in Europe of the unity and struggle of opposites. Imagine two armies that can neither win finally nor stop fighting. In China, at the same time, Lao Tzu was pondering yin and yang, two principles that flow into each other. Xenophanes arrived at the same idea, but in his version it looked like a rough bar fight. When water wins, a flood comes. When earth takes the upper hand, everything dries up and turns to dust. He stripped this process of all mysticism. Poseidon no longer summoned storms with his trident, and Zeus no longer hurled lightning bolts because of a bad mood. Xenophanes was the first to explain that all movement in the cosmos is the result of the friction of these two great principles. The clash of elements is the only engine that turns the wheel of history. Life is merely a short truce in this grand battle, and Xenophanes was the first who found the courage to declare that to understand the world, one does not need to listen to poets. One simply needs to watch who is winning today in this endless dispute between the stone and the wave. So our old wanderer has just explained to us the main engine of the universe. He stripped this process of all mysticism. Poseidon no longer summoned storms with his trident, and Zeus no longer hurled lightning bolts because of a bad mood. Xenophanes was the first to explain that all movement in the cosmos is the result of the friction of two great principles, earth and water. The clash of elements is the only engine that turns the wheel of history. Life is merely a short truce in this grand battle, and Xenophanes was the first who found the courage to declare that to understand the world, one does not need to listen to poets. One simply needs to watch who is winning today in this endless dispute between the stone and the wave. But if earth and water are forever fighting, where do their traces go? The vapors, the mists, the moist air? Xenophanes lifts his head upward, and he sees the sky, and he understands. Here it is, the battlefield that we see every day. Imagine an old man sitting on a hillside looking at the clouds, not as a poet, not as a lover, but as a man who is repairing a leaky roof. He sees how moisture rises from the sea, how it gathers into gray clumps, how these clumps drift across the sky, block the sun, and then pour down as rain back to the earth. And he says to himself, "It is simple. This is not the gods. This is water." Water remembers that it was driven from the land and wants to return. He understood the very mechanism of this cycle. The sun warms the surface of the earth and the sea. Moisture turns into invisible vapor, rises high into the air, and there, in the cold heights, this vapor gathers again into droplets or into tiny ice crystals. Thus clouds are born. Xenophanes did not use the words condensation or evaporation, but he saw the whole chain. Heat, ascent, cooling, return. Simple and clear. Without gods, only the sun, water, and air. Before Xenophanes, other thinkers had already tried to explain heavenly phenomena without the help of the gods. You probably remember our past walks. We listened to Anaximenes of Miletus, who said that everything is made of air, and that clouds are condensed air, like felt that is matted from wool. And remember Anaximander? He taught that the heavenly bodies are fiery wheels enclosed in tubes of condensed air, and we see them only through openings. And Democritus, the very one who invented atoms, believed that the Milky Way is a cluster of tiny stars whose light is so faint that it blends into a single misty band. They were all brave men. They pushed the gods away from everyday life. But Xenophanes went further. He did not merely remove the gods from the sky. He turned the sky itself into an extension of the earth. In his picture of the world, there was no special heavenly matter. Only water, only earth, only their eternal quarrel. The sun, he said, is not a golden chariot of Helios. It is a cloud, but not an ordinary one. It is a cloud of glowing sparks. It gathers each morning like a handful of coals in a fire, and it dies by evening, scattering into ash. And here is the most interesting part. According to his logic, a new sun is born each morning. Not the same one as yesterday, a completely different one. Because clouds do not keep faith. They arise from moisture that has risen from different seas, from different fields, from different rivers. And each sun is unique, like a fingerprint, like morning dew. Imagine this picture, an endless assembly line of light. Each morning, the heavenly forge stamps out a new sun. It burns all day, warms the fields, makes shadows run across the earth. And in the evening, when its sparks cool, it dies and dissolves into darkness. The next morning, a new one. And no one mourns yesterday's sun, because the new one shines just as well. And the rainbow? You will ask. That very iris, the messenger of the gods, who connects heaven and earth with a multicolored bridge. Xenophanes smirks. He looks at the rainbow not as a lovesick poet, but as an old captain who is used to reading the weather by signs. That too is a cloud, he says. Just a special one. Purple, scarlet, green to look at. But there is no goddess there. It is simply light playing in the water dust, like oil on a puddle, like mother of pearl on a shell. In this, he is different from all previous philosophers. Anaximenes saw in clouds air condensed by cold. Anaximander saw in them tubes for fiery wheels. Democritus saw in stars atoms that accidentally collided and lit up. They all sought truth in distant matters, in complex mechanisms, in invisible particles. But Xenophanes simply lifted his head and said, "Here they are. The clouds. The very ones that float above us every day. The whole sky is made of them. The sun, the stars, the rainbow. There is no other matter there." He stripped the sky of its sacred status. He turned it into a vast chemical laboratory. While his contemporaries trembled at the sight of an eclipse, seeing in it the anger of the gods, Xenophanes calmly explained that it was simply one cloud blocking the light of another cloud, or that the moon had simply turned away because the earth's shadow had fallen on it. And there was nothing frightening in this, nothing supernatural, ordinary optics, ordinary physics. And then he took his lyre and wrote down his thoughts in a poem, not in a dry treatise, but in a poem, in rhythmic lines that were easy to remember and pass from mouth to mouth. He called it on nature. And this was the beginning of a new genre. Before Xenophanes, philosophers wrote in prose or in cryptic sayings. After him, the philosophical poem appeared. His student Parmenides would write his own on nature, majestic, strict, full of iron and light. Then Empedocles, the very one who threw himself into the volcano's crater, would write his, colorful as a butterfly's wing. And 500 years later, the Roman Lucretius would create On the Nature of Things, a masterpiece that has survived to our days. And all of them will owe a debt to the old man from Colophon, the one who first guessed that truth can be not only strict, but also beautiful. And that poetry is the best way to light a fire in someone else's head. You will say, but he was wrong. The sun is not a cloud of sparks. The stars are not dying embers. The rainbow is not merely a colored cloud. Yes, he was wrong, but he was wrong beautifully. And more importantly, he was wrong in the right way, because his mistakes were the mistakes of a man who sought the cause not in the whim of the gods, but in the nature of things themselves. He did not say, "This is a miracle, do not explain it, just pray." He said, "Let us think. Let us observe. Let us find the pattern." When Xenophanes finished proving that there is nothing in the sky except scorched clouds and wet vapor, he evicted the gods from Olympus. Not because he hated the poetic talent of Homer, but because he loved the truth. He wanted people to look at the sky not with primitive terror, but with the curiosity of a mechanic who peers under the hood of an old, reliable, well-studied machine. A machine that has worked for thousands of years without failure. Only water, only earth, only their eternal, calm, continuous quarrel. And since the sky is an ordered system, then at the dinner table of a respectable Hellene, there should be no chaos worthy of a pigsty. To understand why Xenophanes suddenly turned into a strict banquet manager, one must remember what a typical symposium was like in the 6th century before Christ. In those days, the feast was the only legal way for men to gather together and not kill each other out of boredom. They were organized often for the occasion of a successful deal, a victory at the races, or simply because the wine had been sitting too long in the cellar. Women, unless they were professional flute players or courtesans of dubious reputation, were not allowed anywhere near them. It was a closed male party, where status was emphasized by the height of the cushions on which you reclined. Xenophanes looked at all this splendor and saw in it merely another reason for human foolishness. His advice on preparing for a feast, preserved to our days in the form of elegies quoted by the later author Athenaeus in his multi-volume work The Deep Nosophists, sounds like instructions for preparing for a surgical operation. Xenophanes demands that the floor be swept to a shine, the hands of the guests washed with the fanaticism of an Egyptian priest, and the cups gleam as if they had just been cast from pure light. He insisted that the wreaths on the heads be fresh, and the incense subtle, not hitting the nose like the smell of burnt meat at a cheap market. Xenophanes tried to teach manners to those who were used to wiping their greasy hands in their own hair. The old man demanded that they begin not with pouring wine, but with a prayer. but not the kind of prayer where one begs the god for a tax discount. A prayer for the strength to act justly. He forbade telling tales about the battles of titans and giants at the table. These are all fictions of the ancients, he grumbled, believing that if grown men gather together, it is fitting for them to discuss civic virtue and the structure of the world, not how Kronos breakfasted on his children. His rules regarding drinking were even harsher. Xenophanes was not an opponent of wine, but he hated the loss of control. He introduced an iron law. Drink enough so that you can walk home on your own 2 feet without the help of a slave, unless you are so decrepit that your legs will not hold you up in principle. In a world where the Greeks considered it proper to mix wine with water in a ratio of 2 to 3, Xenophanes went further. He demanded that the mind always stay afloat, even if the best Chian nectar was splashing in the cup. The feast was for Xenophanes a small model of the world. If you have learned to keep your instincts in check at the dinner table, to distinguish a drunken tale from a bitter truth, and not to turn a conversation into a market brawl, then you are ripe to lay the foundation of a city that will not collapse at the first sneeze of history. He turned the symposium from a drunken orgy into an intellectual laboratory. While other peoples of that time turned feasts into a demonstration of insane consumption, Xenophanes taught the Hellenes that true luxury is not golden dishes, but a clear thought and a clean word. He taught that a man remains a man as long as he is able to distinguish truth from drunken fiction and a worthy conversation from a market shout. These rules became his way of bringing order to the microcosm of a single dining hall, just as he brought order to the macrocosm of the infinite sky. If you imagine an ancient philosopher as an important gentleman in a snow-white toga, pronouncing truths in a tone that brooks no argument, then Xenophanes of Colophon will make you smile. Our old wanderer, who in 67 years of wandering had seen many infallible kings and know-it-all priests, came to a conclusion that puzzled many. His modesty consisted of a simple thought. By definition, a human being cannot possess absolute knowledge, and the one who claims otherwise is most likely just speaking too loudly. Xenophanes was one of the first to call things by their proper names in matters of knowledge. While other wise men tried to appear as if all the secrets of the world were open to them, he calmly said, "Opinion is the lot of all." This is not just a phrase. It is a fragment of his poem that has come down to us through 2,500 years. And it sounds the first posing of the question about the possibility and limits of human knowledge in the history of Greek thought. He did not promise students the keys to the universe. He honestly warned that even if someone accidentally managed to utter pure truth about the gods or the structure of the cosmos, that lucky person would never know it himself. We are all locked in the cramped room of our own perception. Our knowledge is only shadows of truth, nothing more. This was the first inoculation of healthy skepticism in history, and it saved Western thought from finally turning into a collection of beautiful fairy tales. A special portion of his gentle sarcasm Xenophanes reserved for those who were honored in Hellas almost like gods. For the athletes, an Olympic champion in those days could count on free meals for the rest of his days and a statue in his lifetime. But Xenophanes looked at these mighty men with a slight sadness. "Our wisdom is better than the strength of men and horses," he grumbled, sitting on a stone by the road. He understood that a pumped bicep would not help a city pass good laws, and the ability to run fast would not bring a person closer to understanding the structure of the starry sky. Wisdom is a quiet and painstaking work, not a spectacular show at the stadium. He saw in this distortion of values the beginning of trouble, when muscles begin to be valued above reason, and he was not afraid to speak about it out loud, even if a heated wrestler stood nearby who might not like such words. The most striking example of his intellectual honesty was his conversation with Empedocles, that same Empedocles who later, according to legend, would throw himself into the crater of a volcano so that he might be considered a god. But at that time he was still merely a young philosopher, prone to loud phrases and theatrical gestures. Once in Sicily, Empedocles complained to Xenophanes in despair, "To find a true wise man is almost impossible." To which the old man, without raising his voice, replied, "Of course, because to recognize a wise man, you must be wise yourself." The short phrase put everything in its place. Empedocles probably fell silent and thought. Xenophanes reminded him that arrogance is a bad helper in the search for truth. Truth is not prey that can be brought home and roasted for dinner. It is an eternal horizon. It recedes with every step you take, but it is still worth walking. The irony is that this modest confidence in the limitations of human knowledge made Xenophanes one of the most influential thinkers in history. Aristotle, who knew a thing or two about systematization, gave him an honorable place in his history of philosophy. Plato in the Dialogue Sophist called him the founder of the Eleatic school of thought. Parmenides himself, the very one who built the majestic system of unmoving being, essentially developed the metaphysical guesses of the old wanderer. Xenophanes was the first to speak of a single god, not like mortals either in body or in mind. And although Parmenides went his own way, freeing the teacher theology from its imagery, the spirit of free thought, doubt, and rational search for truth is the spirit of Xenophanes himself. In our era, when every second smartphone owner considers himself an expert on all matters at once, the ideas of Xenophanes sound like a breath of fresh air in a stuffy room. He anticipated the modern scientific method. In it, any theory is merely a temporary working hypothesis, which tomorrow may be refined, supplemented, or even discarded. His modesty is the foundation of critical thinking. He taught us that doubting is not weakness. It is the highest form of honesty with oneself. Xenophanes proved that the true wise man is not the one who shouts loudest, but the one who knows when to fall silent and admit, "I may be wrong." In this eternal search, he was ready to go to the end, understanding that the gods did not reveal everything to people at the beginning of time. People themselves, step by step, seeking, find what is better. His skepticism allowed him to attain that very height which is inaccessible to dogmatists, because the awareness of one's ignorance is the first real step toward wisdom, and perhaps the last. When fate, in the person of the Persian king, drove our old man out of his native Colophon, he did not go begging at foreign doorsteps. He set out to find people who, like him, preferred wisdom and the salty wind of freedom to the golden chains of slavery. People who knew how to hold a conversation without turning it into a brawl. People for whom order was not a boring duty but a joy. Such people were found. They were called the Phocians. Imagine a city on the western tip of Asia Minor. Commercial, wealthy, proud. The Phocians were famous not only for gold but also for ships. Their vessels went far to the west, into unknown seas, and returned with cargoes of tin, amber, and stories of lands where the sun sinks into the water. They were seafarers, and thus they knew how to look at the stars not as gods, but as a map. And then the Persian commander Harpagus came to these people. He spoke politely. He smiled. He offered peace. Only symbolic submission. Tear down one tower. Give up one house. Just a little, as neighbors do. The Phocians asked for a day to think, and during that day, they turned their flourishing city into an empty box. They loaded onto ships their wives, children, old men, bronze cauldrons, wooden gods, and even the stone slabs from the city square. They worked like ants that have smelled smoke. And when the Persians entered Phocaea the next morning, they found only dust, abandoned chairs, and bewilderment. The Phocians stood on the decks, watching the smoke of their ancestral hearths slowly dissolve in the sky. And then one of them, the oldest and grayest, took a red-hot piece of iron, threw it into the sea, and said, "We will not return until this ingot floats to the surface." He did not believe that iron would float, and they never returned. Xenophanes attached himself to this company of stubborn fugitives already in his mature years. He had passed through decades of wandering in Sicily, in Xancle, in Catana. He had seen how wealthy cities betray freedom for a bag of gold. And at last he met people who did not haggle, people who called things by their names and said to the Persian, "No." He became one of their own, an Ionian who had lost his home in the same war. But he was not merely a visiting guest with a lyre. He became something greater for them, a chronicler, a prophet, a grandfather who sits on a barrel of salted fish and tells the children why they left home in the first place. There is a tradition that Xenophanes wrote a huge poem, 2,000 hexameters, 2,000 lines about how the Phocians loaded their belongings, how the women wept, how the children saw the open sea for the first time. He did not merely record history. He gave their suffering meaning. He explained to them that their wandering was not a curse but a path, the truest path to the highest truth. The final point of this route was the harsh Eleatic shore. If you want to see a true fortress of the spirit, you should not look at the marble columns of palaces. Look at the cliffs of Lucania. Gray, weather-beaten, poor. The sea here beats with such force that the spray flies up to the clouds. The earth is stony, bread grows poorly, but the air is as clear as glass. And at night the stars hang so low that it seems you could reach out and touch them. In the 540th year before Christ, the Phocians began to build a city. Walls of coastal limestone, narrow streets so that the wind would not blow away the warmth, a square where they could gather and talk. No excesses, only what is necessary. Xenophanes walked among these construction sites, leaning on his staff. He was already very old. His beard had turned as white as the foam on the crests of the waves, but his eyes remained clear. And he spoke. He spoke all the time, about order, about unity, about how the world does not fall apart because it has an inner spring. Here, among the harsh cliffs, he finally stopped beating around the bush. He laid down his main card, the teaching of the one and unmoving being. You will ask what this means. Here is what it means. Xenophanes was tired of running. He had walked the roads for 67 years. He had seen how cities rise and disappear, how kings rise and fall, how gods are born and die. And he understood that there is something that does not run, does not bustle, does not change. That something is reality itself. Not Zeus, not Apollo, not a capricious goddess with a bow, but simply being. Huge, quiet, unmoving. Like this shore, like these cliffs, like the law by which the sea beats against the stone for thousands of years and never grows tired. In a city where every stone was soaked with the sweat of pioneers and the salt of the Tyrrhenian Sea, his ideas fell on fertile ground. Here no one intended to cut corners in matters of honor or logic. The Phocians did not know how to cheat. If they said no, they meant no. If they built a wall, it had to stand. And if Xenophanes said that being is unmoving, they nodded, because they themselves were unmoving in their loyalty to freedom. Among those who listened to his sermons in the city square were the parents of Parmenides, people with nerves of steel cable. They passed on to their son not only property, but also this thirst for uncompromising truth. Parmenides grew up among stories of how his fathers threw iron into the sea and did not look back. And when he created his great poem about being, he heard the voice of old Xenophanes behind him. Xenophanes understood a simple thing. A great city is held together not by trade and not by an army. It is held together by what its citizens believe. If they believe that truth is more important than profit, the city will endure. If they believe that order is more important than chaos, the city will not crumble. He turned a backwater colony into an intellectual fortress. He taught that if you have brought order to the macrocosm of the infinite sky, recognizing it as a reliable mechanism, then in your own polis you must establish laws as solid as rock. Elea became a center of world thought only because its inhabitants knew that freedom is not free. They were not afraid to entrust their fate not to capricious gods from fairy tales, but to cold and pure reason. They built a city where clear thought was valued above golden sand, where instead of drunken brawls at feasts, long, unhurried conversations were held about what truth is. Xenophanes saw in this shore the embodiment of his ideal feast. Strict discipline, absence of illusions, the complete triumph of truth over fiction. He laid the foundation here, and soon his student Parmenides would erect on this foundation the edifice of one of the most powerful logical systems in history. He would prove that the courage of a thinker is in no way inferior to the courage of a warrior who drowned iron in the depths of the sea. If you think that old age is a time to quietly live out your days by the hearth, sorting through dry memories, then Xenophanes of Colophon is ready to surprise you. He lived to be 92 years old, and until the very end, his tongue remained as sharp as a well-honed knife. The ancient books that have come down to us through thousands of years say almost nothing about his family. Diogenes Laertius, that old collector of philosophical gossip, let fall only one short phrase. Xenophanes buried his sons. No names, no faces, no mention of how many there were. Only a dry line that makes your eyes sting. Imagine an old man sitting on a stone by the sea. The wind tugs at his gray beard. There is no one beside him. He looks at the waves and says nothing. Perhaps he is thinking of the boys who once ran on these stones. Perhaps he is holding in his hand a small clay figurine carved by someone's clumsy fingers. The figurine is worn, covered in cracks. But he does not throw it away. Not a single word is said about his wife. No one recorded whether she waited for him through his long years of wandering, or whether she left early, or whether she remained in sacked Colophon. Silence. Only the wind and the sea. Xenophanes was not a homebody. He did not sit by the hearth, did not bounce grandchildren on his knees. He chose the road. For 67 years he walked the dusty trails of Hellas, Sicily, and southern Italy. He saw how cities crumbled to ash, how kings lost their thrones, how gods worshipped yesterday became a laughingstock tomorrow. He wore so much road dust on his sandals that it would have been enough for an entire island. And the price for this life was high. He outlived his children. He died alone, but he did not break. At 92 years old, he was still writing. The Siloi, those caustic, cheerful, angry verses in which he always called things by their proper names. He did not hide the truth behind beautiful words. He spoke directly, without evasion. And even in old age, he did not soften. He reasoned thus. Even if a man is lucky and accidentally stumbles upon pure truth, he still cannot be certain of it. Opinion is the lot of all, the old man would grumble, tapping his staff. We build guesses. We touch shadows. But the true God, that same pure, unmoving mind, looks down on us from above. Without anger, without love, he simply watches, and perhaps waits for us to stop lying to ourselves. In Elea, on that harsh rocky shore, Xenophanes became a living legend. Young philosophers brought him water, sat at his feet, and caught every word. He did not teach them dogmas. He taught them to doubt, to search, not to take things on faith, and not to be afraid of being alone. He knew that his thoughts would outlive him, that his student Parmenides would pick up that banner, that the seeds scattered along the roads would sprout. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps in 100 years, but they would sprout. 92 years is not merely a number on a scroll. It is an entire epoch. In those years, Greek thought grew up, learned to look at the stars without fear, at the gods without trembling, at death without horror. And in this coming of age, the old wanderer had a great share. He who had no home, no money, no family, who had only a lyre in a worn-out case and a voice that cut through the noise of the market crowd. When the time came, he left quietly, like the sea that recedes from the shore in his theory of eternal cycles. He closed his eyes, knowing that his mind had already become part of that very one about which he had argued all his life. And the next time you see a dusty road stretching to the horizon, remember the old man, who walked along it, who lost everything, but did not lose himself, and carried his truth to us across 2,500 years, simply because he was never afraid to call things by their proper names. If you think that after the death of Xenophanes at 92 years of age his ideas were neatly packed into a chest and pushed into a dusty corner of history, then you clearly underestimate the power of a good, caustic truth. Our old man from Colophon left behind a legacy that turned out to be far more durable than the gold mines of Lydia. He did not simply wave goodbye to the Olympian gods. He kicked the stool out from under human self-confidence itself. His legacy of the skeptic became that treacherous stone in the shoe of Western civilization that makes us limp and doubt our own rightness at every convenient opportunity. Xenophanes taught us not merely to think, but to check whether our great truth is merely a reflection of our own face in a puddle. The main blow Xenophanes struck at the very foundation of knowledge. He was the first in Hellas to declare that between our guesses and the real structure of the world lies a chasm as deep as infinity. His idea that even if a man accidentally stumbles upon absolute truth, he will still never be able to verify it, became the cradle of European skepticism. Later, Pyrrho and a whole crowd of professional doubters would pick up this thought, but the first seeds of this great doubt were sown by our wandering Rhapsode. He accustomed us to the idea that we are merely gatherers of opinions, eternal tourists in the museum of reality who are not allowed to touch the exhibits with their hands. The influence of Xenophanes on scientific thought is generally difficult to overestimate, unless you are an utter obstinate man. His method of argument from the absurd, when he proved the absurdity of the Olympian gods through their human vices, became a prototype of scientific criticism. He was the first to show that supernatural crutches are not needed to explain the world. When he explained the rainbow as a physical phenomenon and not as the dress of the goddess Iris, he was literally laying the first stone in the building of future physics and meteorology. He taught us to look for the causes of things in the things themselves, not in the whims of higher powers. In this matter, he never tried to cut corners and never made compromises with venerable priests. But the most powerful resonance of his ideas occurred within philosophy itself. Without Xenophanes, there would have been no Eleatic school, and thus the great Parmenides would have remained merely a talented youth with a good imagination. It was Xenophanes who gave him the base, the idea of the one and unchanging. From here, a direct road leads to Plato with his world of ideas and to Aristotle with his unmoving prime mover. It turns out that all of Western metaphysics is, in essence, a prolonged attempt to make sense of those few daring lines that the old man scratched into his silhouette between lunch and dinner. He made philosophers go the extra mile and ask themselves the question, what if everything we see is merely a ripple on the surface of the unmoving ocean of being? Even modern science, with its quantum uncertainties and black holes, now and then nods in the direction of the old man from Colophon. His insight that our knowledge is only likenesses of truth is surprisingly consonant with the modern scientific method, where any theory is considered true only until it is disproven. Xenophanes taught us intellectual modesty, which does not allow science to turn into a new religion. He proved that one cannot know the answers to all questions and still not be a fool. His legacy is the right to doubt, the right to search, and the right to laugh at one's own importance. In the end, Xenophanes of Colophon did for Western thought what a good carpenter does for a shaky house. He leveled the horizon. He taught us to look at the sky not with terror, but with the curiosity of a mechanic. His life of 92 years became proof that a reasonable man can get the upper hand in an argument with eternity if he has enough courage to admit the limitations of his own vision. He left, leaving us alone with this huge, cold, and amazingly logical world, where there is no place for fairy tales, but there is infinite space for thought. And in this lies his main victory. He made us grow up, even if we really did not want to.